Great, wonderful. Thank you for those presentations. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. I just wanted to start us off with a question of my own, since I get the microphone at this moment. So each of you are really, working on these projects that are about bringing together data sets, archives, and combing through it and beginning to make sense of it. And it's kind of that process that Paul was mentioning of moving from data to applied research. So this is maybe a little bit speculative for you to think about, but as we're thinking through these manufacturing and corporate histories, which I think is such an important part of photo history that has been relatively neglected. For each of you, I just wanted to kind of lob a question your way and see what you might say about it. But for Allison, when do you think, when did OBAs come into general use, and why is there a kind of lag of photography taking that up? Do you have any kind of thoughts about why that process unfolded the way it did? Sydney, a question about back printing. You mentioned that it was used in chemical baths, so that makes a lot of sense for photographers to kind of monitor what's happening in the darkroom. But what else, what other reasons might they have had for doing that other than a kind of marketing element? And then, of course, now we have these contemporary uses in authentication. And then, Thomas, you were mentioning these trademark deposits, which are fantastic, and you were giving the example of orthobrome. What other kinds of questions do you think might be useful for historical research that can be based on the kinds of collection that you've been building here? So I'll leave it there.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. In regards to the introduction of OBAs to kind of the widespread use of OBAs in the marketplace, I really think, thinking back to that kind of original figure from Paul's 2005 study, you can really see these trends. Also the spectrophotometer data, you can see that trend. I think really in the 60s is when it really started to pick up. But again, I think this really came down to a lot of the time photographer preferences. Again, you kind of see there was a drop off in the 70s before the 80s. And I think, again, it just really came down to photographer preference. I know I've read a few years ago that Ansel Adams was experimenting with OBAs and then ultimately kind of pulled away because he didn't like the kind of stark brightness that they created on the resulting photographs. But I think also just as the OBAs became increasingly more common, the availability was just there for them to really start adding them in this really widespread manner throughout the entire marketplace, across multiple brands, across multiple areas of production. And then, like I said, by the 90s, almost every paper had OBAs. And I don't know, this is speculative, I don't know if it's because people wanted to move away from that kind of antiquated, potentially, appearance of that kind of warmer, non-brightened paper, and they wanted kind of this new modern, sleek look. Purely speculative, but definitely by the late 90s, even if you wanted the warmer paper, it would be very difficult to find just because there wasn't a demand for it.
I've been thinking about this. I'm a little stumped, but it's an excellent question, Monica, about other purposes of why backprints were put on the papers. And we're still uncovering a lot.
Up, please.
Sorry, can you hear me? Thank you. I apologize. So we're still uncovering, and we're finding so there's a lot of research into the study of backprinting, and as many of you all know, the primary source material for this is very rare. I can only cite a few examples in our collection where they've actually spelled out what they refer to these dots in the AGFA backprints, for example. But besides, increasing the company and the brand awareness with the logo, we can, the processing instructions it was kind of an eye-opening thing for us, or at least for me when I first came into this project. But interestingly, once we found out, for example, about the double lines placed above and below, and we looked at that time period, I was able to we were looking at similar double lines with that pattern well into the 60s, the 70s, and they were still glossy papers for the ones that we were looking at. So I don't know when they, it kind of just tells us that this was a trend that they were sticking to, but a lot of these manufacturers changed the backprints, meaning it's a real area for future research. I think it's hard to kind of right now I don't have the answers of what these mean, and but we're uncovering a lot of this.
Yeah.
And hopefully this is a good starting point for researchers to really do deep dives into these companies and look for these patterns.
So we do get a lot of international researchers who do research on the production of the underlayer, but the part of the archive that maybe interests me the most is there's a box for nearly every country in which Gevaert was active. I've done a bit of research into this myself for the exposition. We've made a world map with rough dates from when Gevaert was active in a country until when. For example, 2 countries of particular interest were Iran and Cuba. In Cuba, they did a prospective trip in 1928, but it turned out the products weren't suited for tropical temperatures. They basically fell apart. And in Iran, they couldn't get a permit to operate. So this is, I think, you can really start making a company history in these different countries because, for example, also Gevaert America had a very broad range. I'm thinking of how to say this in English. Were independent. Yeah, that's the word. Gevaert France as well. Gevaert Egypt as well. These were very independent branches. So I think there's a lot of research to be done there. How these companies operated, how they marketed their products to their countries the branch was active in. Yeah, that's one of the main exciting things I think there is to be learned in the archive, or at least one that really interests me.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm happy to open things up to the audience now, so please raise your hand if you have a question, and somebody please wait for the microphone to come to you as this is being recorded. So I see some hands toward the back.
Hi, my question is for Sydney. That was great to revisit that research. I think we should do that more often. My question is a little bit practical one. Can you tell me if there's, so we've been presented the new database, the paper-based one. What is the difference between the data we can find on the backprint website versus the new database? Because I think I've seen some backprinting on both.
The new, the question is between the old database, the old website and the new website?
No, between the new website and the paper-based website.
I think the backprinting website is a little bit more focused, so you can easily look at chronology and you can see the patterns a little bit easier. You can also bounce, it's more focused on the backprinting, and also there's a lot of overlap. I mean, you can still see the metadata is the same. You can still look at the images are all, it's just more focused on the coding system, and you can see all of the codes together and look for, you can compare and contrast them yourselves and see how they're similar, how they're different, but it's just all together.
Thank you.
Hello? Hi, okay. My name's Opal. Hi, thank you, everyone. I had a couple of small questions. One was about OBAs and their degradation over time, and what might someone want to know about the effect of time and light exposure on the response of the OBAs, in like terms of is that a statistically significant degradation that you're able to see? Regarding the backprinting, I just wanted to ask if you knew at what stage in the printing process, or what stage in the manufacturing process is it associated with the paper base, or is it done post coating of the emulsions, in terms of like what the relationship is between those? And lastly, to a question about Gevaert, if you know anything about their silver sourcing. It's an area I've been researching with paper photographic materials. Anyway, thank you.
So I can start. I'm not 100% sure about how OBAs degrade. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on OBAs, but I can say based on what I've seen in the LML collection, again, these are stored in archival conditions, so these aren't necessarily displayed in the same way that a photograph might be. Again, there's also variations in how things can be displayed in a museum setting versus in the home where there's lots of UV light. So I can't necessarily speak to that, but I know within the collection, I don't think that we've seen any degradation of the OBAs, because I feel like if we had, then when we're looking chronologically, especially in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, when you have really this really large presence of OBAs, I feel like if they were starting to degrade, at least within the 20-year span that it's been since then, I think we would start to see a drop-off in the brightness. But again, time will tell, I'm sure, and I'm sure Paul also could speak to this a little bit later if you're interested to hear more.
For the backprinting question, which is a really good question, I think Paul and Cappy could also speak to that too during the exact, but I think I remember from the translation that it was about so when the papers were wet, it was hard to distinguish which ones were supposed to be dried for high gloss and which ones were semi-matte or matte papers. But the exact processing that the printers did, I'm not sure exactly, at what point that was really, important for them for separating, but if Cappy or Paul, you might know. No? Maybe?
It's my understanding that the backprints were put on when the paper bases were manufactured.
Well, yeah, they were made, but then it was, why was it, so they were put on before they were, so that when they were wet in the bath, that they could distinguish which ones were going to be high gloss versus matte. I think that's what the translation said. Sorry for any confusion.
For the silver sourcing, I'm not sure where exactly they got their silver. I'm sure I can find out. I'm sure it's going to be in the archive. I do know there was an urban legend of a man who, Jevart basically dumped their wastewater in a local river, and there was a local man who started sieving out the silver of the water. It seemed to have some source of truth. He sold the silver, got rich from it, and then Jevart decided, hey, we need to start recycling this wastewater. So I do know from a certain period onwards, they built extensive recycling plants to get the silver out again and reuse it. As for the silver sourcing itself, I'm sure I can find out. If you send me an email, I can look it up.
I actually have a follow-up question for the backprinting. Interesting how it was produced, and also the material that used for backprinting, so will survive the darkroom process. Any idea about the material they used for the backprinting?
That's a great question. I don't know. This study, I feel like we were really pushing to get all of these, all of the scans imaged, but the research potential on this, I just don't know. But it's, again, future research.
Yes, I guess on the back printing again, seems to be. When printing in the black and white darkroom, you're under amber light, which is low light. Some people use red or an orange. So in the presentation that you give, you have circles, and ACFA also made contrast papers, contrast 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm just wondering if those dots, the circles, which might reflect the camera, lens, the aperture opening, might be a code for this is contrast 1, contrast 2, 2 dots, 3, 4. I mean, I have some of that ACFA paper from the 70s. I could look, but if it gets wet, I don't know what the stamp is. It's not, because in your presentation, you've highlighted the stamp in black, so obviously the paper, when it's manufactured, it's on, big rolls in complete darkness. Is the stamp embedded in, like embossed, like, printmaking, So with Fuji Crystal Archive, which is our C paper, the stamp, you can't open the paper in the color darkroom, obviously, you expose everything, which is a light tight, different darkroom printing situation. So I'm wondering when these dots appeared, if there's a record of their, being introduced to the back of the paper, and, that there, they might be a code for the contrasts. I'm just doing detective work. I mean, you said it's an open field of research, so.
Yeah, I would be welcome. I mean, that sounds. All I can say is that we saw in that 1955 book, the Handbuch der Agfa Photopapyra, that was published in 1955. They mention, actually they don't mention the dots there, but in looking at the collection, I remember, so Cappy kind of, we were looking at these lines and we were thinking the dots must be for something for processing. It just made sense. Like there's just like, they seem to have a pattern like the dots. Like sometimes we were looking at these and they were actually, some of them contained like 3 dots, and then other logos had 1 or 2 dots on the same page, and it was kind of, it just seems like a coding system that we just can't decode right now. But in looking at the papers, to answer your question about the emergence of these dots, we saw a lot of them emerge in the late 50s. And then they were, and you can check the website for this, but we looked for earlier areas I couldn't find any in our collection that had dots in the 40s. They really started to come out around that time, but we did not have any literature like the Walter Harnow's book that really like specified why they were added at this time. But I can say that, just in process of elimination, because this book was published in 1955 and it mentions the lines to specify high gloss surfaces, I've seen the dots that are also in some areas on papers that are matte, but it's not always the case. So I don't think it has to deal with a glossy or matte surface, but there's got to be something else.
And they're all the same size, and they're exactly in the same location on the back, in the back printing?
It's a good research project. We weren't able to really look at them together. All I could say is that it seemed very random. Like there were dots that were, like there were 3 underneath AGFA combined with just a AGFA plain logo. There were others that the dots seemed to not be exactly aligned underneath at the same location. So, yeah, I encourage you to take a deeper dive into it, and it's a good place to start on the website. But again,
Okay.
Thanks, Ellen. That seems
Yeah,
like
you're
a great
welcome. Thank
suggestion of looking at
Thank
that.
you.
And let's let Allison have the last question before we break.
Oh, I think it's on. There. This is for Thomas. We are a specialized audience and fascinated by everything that's been discussed. What is the reaction by the general public to the Gevaert Archive exhibition?
As far as I can gather, I've only had positive reactions, but of course maybe our front desk has had negative reactions. No, I've had quite a few emails. There's been a lot of ex-employees of Gevaert who've come to watch the exhibition, who state they've come only to watch the Gevaert exhibition. I've had other reactions as well who say they really prefer the Gevaert Archive exhibition over the usual art exhibitions of photographers we do. So what I've seen, it's only been positive. We've had a reaction from someone from the Netherlands as well, who asked if it was a traveling exhibition. It's not, but maybe if some institution is interested, but since he was a particular, he didn't have an institution. So anyway, yeah, all I've seen were positive reactions. If there were any negatives, they haven't reached me.
Thank you all for these great questions and for joining us this morning. There's now boxed lunches available in the Steep Cafe. There will be staff in the lobby directing us towards that. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. for the next session, so please join me one more time in thanking our wonderful presenters.